So I'm going to talk about Venezuela, but my family's also from Sudan. My father was detained and released when Omar Bashir fell. So if you permit me, I'll speak the last couple of minutes just updating you about the situation there as well. But anyway, to start off with Venezuela, before I start talking about Venezuela, I first have to give a tribute to the people of Venezuela who've survived and resisted against some of the harshest sanctions. Despite all that pressure, have refused to bow down to US imperialism. I'd also like to thank the Venezuelan football team for beating the US 3-0 at home. They beat the US in their own backyard in true Monroe style. I'd like to thank Greg for organising this event and calling it Imperialism on Trial, because if we had a free and accountable press, imperialism would always be on trial. But unfortunately we don't, so that's why we're all here. And also, one of the big messages that I took away from Venezuela in the 6.5 weeks that I was there was collective power. You might have heard the term collectivo, stigmatised in the corporate and mainstream press. But essentially, it's an idea that people can and people should. Yes. So here we are in a room together. We're all here for an event called Imperialism on Trial. So I'd just like to take 10 seconds where you basically introduce yourself to the person next to you that you don't already know. Go ahead. Thank you. I see some people have used it as an opportunity to leave. It's okay. So basically, if I'm going to give you one prevailing message, one prevailing narrative, is belief. So, of course, what's happened to Julian, the crimes of imperialism, British imperialism, American imperialism are terrible, but they don't always win. And in the 6.5 weeks that I was in Venezuela, they lost. They had some aims and objectives, and they failed. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, about my journey over the 6.5 weeks. But also, we talk about Venezuela, and we say the US is doing this because of Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves, because it has diamonds, because it has gold, because it has water. And all those things are true. But in my humble opinion, it's more ideological. They do not want to see a free and independent sovereign state doing as it pleases. Now, I forget what speaker said this earlier about extrajudicial idea that the world is owned by America. Well, the Venezuelan people think Venezuela is owned by Venezuelans. And it's a basic idea that the collective are the authors of their own destiny. So it shouldn't be decided in a boardroom by 12 people that nobody sees. But actually, communities should come together and take control of their lives. So I went to a community called Cacachia in northwestern Caracas, in which they lobbied the government and they said, this is a bit of land, we want it. We want you to give us equipment to train us and for us to build the houses there. The government did that. 45% of the workforce was the residents. And I went there and I saw people with pride because they were living in houses that they built themselves, rent-free, that each family was represented on a community council. If there was any decisions to be made, it should be done collectively. And these are the collectivos that our Western corporate media stigmatizes and tries to make us think that the idea that the working people coming together and making decisions that affect their lives is somehow problematic. Well, it is problematic to them and their corporate interests, and that's where those kind of stories go from. So I went to Venezuela I was there from February the 8th to March the 23rd. Juan Guaido, who was previously mentioned here, he became the president of the National Assembly on the 5th of January, and then declared himself the president of I'm about to say United States, but Freudian slip. He declared himself the president of Venezuela on the 23rd of January, one day after allegedly speaking to Mike Pence on the phone. Now, apparently, Juan Guaido's representatives had assured Pence and Pompeo and the other neocons that the army would flip. That didn't happen. So that was plan A, failed. Then there was the humanitarian aid trucks fiasco. So I went to the bridges, Santander Bridge and Simon Bolivar Bridge, which connects Colombia to Venezuela. And this event is called Imperialism on Trial, but I want us to focus on the co-conspirators as much, and that's the media. Because a journalist in the UK, I've seen exaggeration about, or bias when it comes to the mainstream press. But what I saw in Venezuela could only be described as outright lies. So I went on a commercial flight to San Antonio. On that flight were young men who clearly had been paid to get on the flight, all with the same haircut, all seemed to dye their hair blonde. I don't know what that's about. And they were making their way to the border. They were singing songs about Maduro and Maduro's mother. There's this thing called the Maduro Challenge, where someone shouts Maduro and then I'm not going to repeat because we're live. But it kind of just shows the mentality of these young men that were whisked over to the bridge. And so then I went to the bridge. I saw these men with Molotov cocktails, stones, and they were throwing it at the Venezuelan army. And the army tried to resist, and the Venezuelan army had a crowd of supporters behind them, basically cheering on every time they pushed back these armed men who were throwing Molotov cocktails. Yet, when I went home and watched the corporate media's portrayal, they made them seem like Kumbaya, my lord, humanitarian aid volunteers. And that's when I first saw the first deception. I was meant to meet my translator on the bridge, because obviously I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately. And he was coming from Caracas on a bus full of supporters, government supporters. I called him to see where he was, and he told me that the bus that he was on was attacked and set on fire. Now, obviously, I was terrified by this news, and I was happy that he was okay. And then I went home. I'll post a link in the comment section so people can verify this. I went home and I saw MSNBC reporter say this. They set that bus on fire to show their disapproval at the aid not being allowed in. And I just thought to myself, I watched the coverage of what's going on in Palestine and the coverage of the Great March of Return. Yet when Palestinians try to return to their ancestral homes and they're attacked by Israeli soldiers with sniper rifles, the justification for the mainstream and corporate media is that the Israeli soldiers have a right to defend themselves. Yet, in Venezuela, it goes the other way around. So when armed men with Molotov cocktails set buses on fire, they're justified. And if you was under any illusion that this was about humanitarian aid, it wasn't. So the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, the UN, all wanted no part of this humanitarian aid adventure because, I'll read the quote, a UN spokesperson said, humanitarian aid needs to be independent of political, military, or any other objectives. The needs of the people should lead in terms of when and how humanitarian aid assistance is used. Now, Venezuela was already receiving aid from Cuba, China, Russia, Qatar, Turkey, amongst other nations. So why would they receive aid from the US, 20 million worth of aid, at a time when the US is sanctioning Venezuela, is supporting a puppet guy with no support? 81% of Venezuelans had never heard of him before he put his hand out and said he was the president of the country. Why would they accept humanitarian aid under those conditions? They wouldn't. They'd be crazy to. But yet, this discussion was never kind of portrayed in the media. So they said they was going to breach the border. It never happened. The Venezuelan army resisted. Then there was the humanitarian aid trucks that were set on fire. Again, me, Max Blumenthal, Eva Bartlett, other people that were there reported that if anyone set the humanitarian aid trucks on fire, it's most likely the guys with the masks throwing the Molotov cocktails. We were called conspiracy theories, Maduro's puppets. I was actually one of these opposition supporters, trailing off a little bit here. One of these opposition supporters went on my Instagram, found a boxing video of me fighting for charity, and used that to say Maduro's hiring Cuban boxers to come and do his propaganda. Anyway, it was a kind of a compliment because I don't think my boxing style was that on point. So the humanitarian aid trucks were set on fire. Everyone in the mainstream media blamed the government, and then 2 weeks later, the New York Times published that they found via their own independent investigation that the humanitarian aid trucks were set on fire, most likely by the humanitarian aid volunteers. And all of a sudden, our opinions then become validated. And then between the 7th and the 10th of March, there was a blackout. This is what I call Plan B. So the humanitarian aid, the army didn't flip was Plan A. Humanitarian aid trucks was meant to infiltrate the border and bring into question Venezuelan sovereignty. That didn't work. And then there was Plan C, in which there was a blackout. Now, to put this into context, Juan Guaido was about to do a tour around Europe, and his supervisors in Washington told him to get back to Venezuela and take advantage of the momentum. Now, there was no momentum. He'd announced that he was going to do a protest on the weekend, which was, I think, March the 9th. Little to no kind of attention on social media. And on March the 7th, the Thursday, there was this blackout. I was in Venezuela at the time. I think I was in the bathroom when the lights went off. And before I'd realised the lights had gone off, Marco Rubio had already tweeted about it. And he'd actually tweeted that the backup generators had also gone down. Information that wasn't even known to the Venezuelan government. Now, some people would say that the accusation by the Venezuelan government that this was an act of sabotage is convenient. But then we've got the WikiLeaks cables that help us. So there was a WikiLeaks cables about a group called Canvas, which was a Belgrade democracy promotion group in 2010 that wrote a memo to Venezuelan opposition groups to take advantage of a blackout and to use that as an opportunity to undermine the government. The fact that this happened, the fact that Call of Duty in 2013 had one of its missions that you had to attack the Guri hydroelectrical dam in Bolivar State to cause unrest in the streets. And when the Call of Duty, for those that don't know Call of Duty, it's a popular video game. And when a Call of Duty director was asked how it was so accurate, he said that he spoke to the who's who in the Pentagon to find out who's going to be the enemy of tomorrow and what is done in these type of circles to make it as realistic as possible. So all of these things indicated to me that the sabotage was part of this plan to destabilize and overthrow the government of Nicolás Maduro. But it failed.
Bravo.
It failed. During my time in Venezuela, there was opposition protests. They were large at the beginning, but what was ignored by the mainstream media was the equally large pro-government protests. So I actually went on the same day to 2 protests to do a news package on both. When I went on Google to search about the Maduro protest, it didn't exist. It never happened, even though they had equally large numbers. Towards the end of my trip, Juan Guaido tried to organise a protest in the working class neighbourhood of El Valle. I don't know if any of you saw that video. He basically got chased out by the residents and got called a traitor. He hasn't tried to organise a protest that I know of since. Now, John White mentioned the George Orwell quote about, in the age of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. I just want to finish on my Venezuela section by just saying, when we talk about Julian Assange and what he's done and the bravery because with his skill set, with his intelligence, he could have had a nice, comfortable life, gone on 2-3 holidays a year, but he chose not to. The same way, to somewhat a lesser degree, you lot have chose not to by being here and sharing the WikiLeaks cable, which I'm sure you will do. So we're in this together, we have collective power, and together, imperialism will fail. Now, just before I finish, I just want to talk about Sudan real quick, because as the brother mentioned from Ecuador, imperialism has junior partners. In every part of the world, they have junior partners. In Latin America, they have Colombia, Chile, and most recently Ecuador. In the Middle East, they have Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Now, what's happening in Sudan is related to all three of those powers. So, to put this into perspective, on Monday, there was 108 people killed in Khartoum. There's estimated 164 people killed in the Darfur region just yesterday. And why is this happening? So Sudan was once seen as a hostile nation. Yet it's done everything in its power to try to change that. And in fact, there was a rapprochement with the US recently, hence why it was on the Muslim ban, then it wasn't on the Muslim ban. There was talks to have the sanctions lifted, for it no longer to be a state sponsor of terror. All of this was based on one condition. Sudan provides the foot soldiers for the Saudi-led war on Yemen. So what people don't understand is, in the Saudi-led war on Yemen, the Saudis don't do the fighting. It's my brothers in Sudan that have nothing to do with that war. And that was the condition to have the sanctions and to have rapprochement with the West. The Sudanese government regime was approached by the UAE and Saudi Arabia and said, listen, we can get you back in the good books if you provide the foot soldiers. They obliged. So when we overthrew the dictator of Omar al-Bashir, we've now been going through a battle to dismantle the military dictatorship. The reason why that battle has faced difficulties is because the Saudis, the UAE, know that if there was a civilian-led government in Sudan, the first thing that we would do is take ourselves out of the war on Yemen. Now, the head of the so-called Transitional Military Council, a guy called General Burhan, he went to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE days before this slaughter of our brothers and sisters in Sudan. There were 40 bodies found in the River Nile. Some of them had bricks to them, so they wouldn't rise up to the surface. Women have been dragged out of cars, raped. Now, this wouldn't... The war on Yemen itself is because they don't want to see a free and independent, sovereign Arab country right next to Saudi Arabia. But this couldn't happen without the acceptance of the European and American powers. Now, within this whole rapprochement, so I know I'm going over time, so I'll be as quick as possible. The Janjaweed, which was slaughtering our brothers in Darfur, has been renamed the Rapid Support Forces. The reason why it's called the Rapid Support Forces is because, just like in Syria, it's hard to do work with the Al-Qaeda, so you call them Al-Nusra or Sham this or Sham that. The same thing happened in Sudan. So they renamed them Rapid Support Forces, and the UK, the European Union, and Norway have basically given the green light to the Sudanese regime from when Omar Bashir was in power to do whatever they want as long as they stop migrants and refugees coming into Europe. So they bank on the fact that these Rapid Support Forces are habitual human rights abusers, because they know it'll only take a hard approach like that to stop migrants from coming to Europe. The same thing happens in Libya. They work with the slave masters and the slave raiders to stop the refugees from going. So anyway, the same way that our people won in Venezuela, our people will win in Sudan. Thank you very much.